this evening. And here we are talking about happiness. So as Matty said in the introduction, I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour or so, tops, something like that. Then we'll have time for some questions. Difficult questions are welcome. If you would like to give Matt a difficult question, I'm sure he will feel left out if he doesn't get one. So do save up a real stinker. He would be grateful for that. But happiness, then, is the thing we're talking about this evening. And to kind of set the scene, a few years ago, a friend of mine was on an airplane flight, was going on holiday, and by some amazing stroke of luck, got one of those free upgrades that come along like once in 100 blue moons, and actually got upgraded to business class, and was just enjoying all the perks that came with that. But because of that, found herself sitting on the plane next to somebody who was actually quite well known. I am not going to name drop this evening, but this was a former sports personality. If I mentioned this gentleman's name, probably most of you in the room, even if you are not sports fans, would have heard of this individual. Well, it turned out this sports personality, former sports personality, was a bit of a nervous flyer. So even while the plane was was pushing back from the terminal, he was knocking back whiskies and other kind of hard liquor, clearly looking very nervous. And actually, as the plane began taxiing down the runway, he literally grabs hold of my friend's hand, holds on for dear life, and starts talking not so much to her as at her. And he tells her all about his former career in professional sport. He tells her all about his family and his kids, all about the things he'd done since he'd ceased playing professional sport, about the businesses he started. He began boasting a bit about how much he was worth and the size of his bank account. On and on he went. And then finally, he paused for breath. Finally, at about 10,000 feet, he actually shut up. And my friend looked at him and said to this gentleman, she said, "My word, what a life you've had, mate. What a life. You must be one of the happiest people in the world. You must be incredibly happy, all the stuff you've done and the stuff that you've got." She said it was amazing because there was a long silence. He actually blinked back tears, looked at the floor, and then turned and looked at her and said, "No, I'm actually as miserable as hell." Well, somewhat concerned, my sort of friend asked a few questions, dug a bit, and it turned out that his problem was actually he was living in his own shadow. He'd risen so high, he'd been so successful that he wasn't an idiot. He now knew really he was looking at a decline into obscurity, and he couldn't really hack that and was just wrestling with what the rest of his life was all about. Interesting story, right? We live in an age that encourages us to find our happiness in the things that we do and the stuff that we have. We live in a culture that tells us that you can find happiness in the size of your bank account, the amount of things that you have, your career, whether that's in business or if you're a student, those kind of things, your career and your performance are where you can find happiness. In fact, it's interesting, isn't it? In our culture, one of the first things you do, right, when you meet a new person and you're getting to know somebody, what do you say to them? We ask them, "What do you do?" Social media sites like LinkedIn are built around that. They are built around people identifying themselves by the stuff that they do. On our social media profiles, for those who are on whatever channels we're on, we identify ourselves by the things that we do, our careers, our workplaces, our CVs. We live in a culture that says it's all about what you do and what you own. That's how you find happiness. Well, the interesting thing is the science is pretty clear. The science shows this approach to life simply is not working. Since 1993, the American psychologist Tim Klasser, there on the screen behind me, he's been leading a university team tracking a thing called the Aspiration Index. They've been tracking people's happiness now since 1993, 30 years this year they've been running that project. And they have found in survey after survey and study after study that people who put career, finance, performance, academic success, people who put those things ahead of emotional or spiritual development, people end up suffering. If you do that, you experience more stress, more depression, more anxiety. You are more prone to depression. You're more prone to substance and alcohol abuse. You are more prone to narcissism. You are more prone to a sense that life is joyless. The science is utterly clear. If you try and base your life on what you do and the things that you have, you will pay a terrible price. Now that conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, is not a new one. That is not a new conclusion. The emotional consequences of trying to find your happiness in your work or your performance or the stuff that you do was actually we first realized this was a problem over 2,500 years ago. Over 2,500 years ago, the writer of Ecclesiastes, one of the most fascinating books in the Hebrew Bible, explores and wrestles with this very issue. The author of that book, often considered to be King Solomon, describes a life that few of us here this evening could dream of. He wrote, "I undertook great projects. I built houses, I planted vineyards, I made gardens and parks, I planted fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I owned more herds and more flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I denied myself nothing. I refused my heart no pleasure." And I have to say, if I was sitting next to King Solomon on an aeroplane, like my friend next to that sports celebrity, I guess I would turn to the dude and go, "Mate, you must be really happy." So what he says next is fascinating, because Solomon goes on to conclude. He says, "So I hated life. I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And so my heart began to despair over all of my toilsome labor under the sun." Apart from that phrase, "under the sun," on an evening like tonight, many of us can probably agree or resonate with some maybe of what Solomon's saying there. Do you know, it's fascinating that in over 2,500 years, we have progressed in so many ways. We have better technology, better healthcare, science. We have the ability to find amusing memes at the touch of a button. But when it comes to happiness and satisfaction, we are still struggling. Do you know, every week, over 1 million people in the West type the word happiness into Google and searching for something. We may be using newer technology than the writer of Ecclesiastes, but we are asking the same questions and struggling to find the answers. But I wonder whether one of the reasons why our culture and why some of us here this evening struggle with this whole question of happiness is we haven't always worked hard enough to think about the word happiness itself. We throw the word happiness around. We talk about being happy or wanting to be happy. We ask one another, "Are you happy?" But we haven't thought about what does the word happy, what does the word happiness actually mean? What do we mean by that word? Well, many of the ancient Greek philosophers, most notably Aristotle, one of the most famous ancient thinkers of his age, thought a lot about this question. And Aristotle suggested there are actually 4 levels of happiness. And unless we are filling in all 4 of those levels, we are ultimately not going to be satisfied in life. And he said it is vital that you understand the differences between them. So what did he mean? Let's take a look. Happiness level 1. What's happiness level 1? Well, happiness level 1 is animal happiness. It's animal happiness. It's all about the fulfillment of appetite. So it works like this. I see the donut. My tummy rumbles. I salivate. I'm happy. I see the donut. Better still, I eat the donuts. And it's very exciting. And I can repeat this a few times, in fact, until I'm full. If it's a large stack of donuts, I can work my way through it, and my wife is not watching. But it's transient, right? Eventually, it's over. Eventually, there are no more donuts, or you've eaten so many, you've simply made yourself sick. And that's the problem. The problem is that when you misuse your appetites, you don't end up happy, you end up unhappy. If you misuse food, for example, if you use food to cope with anxiety and depression, it can get very serious. You can end up with what doctors call an eating disorder, and that's a very dark place to be. Similarly, we live in a culture that tells us that you can use sex the same way that we use food. If you fancy somebody, just sleep with them. But the problem is, if you have sex unconnected from committed love, it often simply becomes boring and produces not happiness but unhappiness. That's why so many people have these transient relationships, bouncing from relationship to relationship to relationship, because they are trying to use sex to fill the gap that love was intended to fill, and it doesn't work, and they move on to use up the next person. And simply put, if you try and live just at level 1, you will end up not happy but unhappy. And if you are unhappy at level 1, the only solution, you've got to try going up. You have to move to happiness level 2. Now, what is happiness level 2? I hear you cry this evening, or I would if you were a slightly more interactive audience. What is happiness level 2? Does that too involve donuts? No, it does not. Happiness level 2, what is that? Happiness level 2 is all about comparison. Happiness level 2 is all about having something more of something than the other person. Maybe I have more money, or I have more influence, more followers on social media. Some people have called this the comparison game. And there's nothing actually inherently wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with developing a skill and using it well, excelling at it, and doing better than somebody else. We do that in sport, we can do that at work, we can do that at school. There is nothing wrong with those things. It can bring great happiness. But the problem is this. Happiness level 2, that kind of comparison thing, can only last for a while. Eventually, you will peak. Think of the sports player on the plane. He'd been at the top for years, no longer at the top. One day, you will arrive at the top of the mountain, the top of the roller coaster, and you will start the descent the other time. You know, you may well be the smartest student at school, but then somebody else joins your class and they're smarter than you and your reputation is not what it was. Maybe you have an injury and you're no longer the fastest person on the sports field. Maybe you simply get old and you're no longer able to perform the way that you were. Trying to live entirely at this level is an absolute guarantee to end up with all of that stress and anxiety that psychologists like Tim Classer, who we talked about earlier, has been studying. You get stress and anxiety because you are constantly faced with nagging questions. What happens when I'm no longer at the top? What happens if I make a mistake and get fired? What happens if my performance metrics at work fail and the bosses get cross with me? What happens if my company hire a new employee who is better than I am? What happens if the voters reject me? Very soon, you will find out yourself, you'll find yourself living in an unhappiness level 2. And if you're unhappy at level 2, the only solution is, of course, to move up to happiness level 3. What is happiness level 3? I hear you cry, or I would if this was a more interactive audience, or we wired the seats up to the mains and Matty pressed the button at the right moment of the talk. What is happiness level 3? Well, happiness level 3 is interesting because happiness level 3, that next level up, comes through living for somebody other than yourself. It comes through investing yourself, pouring yourself into doing something for others. It's liberating, it's rewarding primarily because it's not competitive, and perhaps the best example is parenthood. You know, if you're a parent, you can pour your life and your energy into your kids and doing things for others. But what if you're not a parent? Well, if you're not a parent, you can still find happiness level 3. You can serve others. You can give your time and your energy, your efforts to help others less fortunate than yourself. I lived for a while in Canada about 10 years ago, and we have two very good friends of ours in Canada. The husband is a doctor, the wife is a lawyer, so they are fairly well off, and they started a non-profit charity that digs wells for poor communities in parts of Africa, and they say the difference that has made to their lives and their families because they've been able to pour what they have into the lives of others. They found it tremendously rewarding. It's had a terrific impact. This all sounds wonderful, right? But there is a problem with trying to live your life entirely at level 3. And the problem is it comes to an end. It comes to an end. If you're a parent, your children will soon grow up and leave home. If you have teenagers in the house, you may be thinking, bring it on, quite frankly. But it's a big issue. We have a name for it, don't we? We call it the empty nest syndrome. It can be a very difficult time in families. If you invested your time and energy in serving others, like my friends in Canada, well, if you do your job well, there'll come a time when they no longer need you because you've gotten to a point where they're independent. You cannot be everything to somebody else. If you try that, you will end up unhappy at level 3. But there's a further problem in all of this too, and the one that's deeply ironic. If you just try and find happiness at this level, at level 3, the problem is that actually it's selfish. This point was actually first pointed out by one of the most famous atheists of the 19th century, a man called Friedrich Nietzsche, a very influential philosopher and arguably possessor of the most impressive moustache in the history of Western philosophy. Very committed atheist, but he pointed out once, he said, so many modern people help other people purely so they can feel good about themselves. Purely so they can feel good on the inside. And he pointed out, if that's the case, you're not helping others, you're just helping yourself. You're just feeling good and using other people as a means to the end, that end. And you know, that failure of happiness levels 1 through 3 to ultimately give happiness, I sometimes find leads some people, many people I think sometimes, round about middle age, into a sort of sense of cynicism. Often, I turned 50 last October, so I guess I now am officially middle-aged. And I've had many conversations with friends in my generation who say to me things like, do you know, when I was younger, I thought there was real happiness, real fulfillment out there, but now I'm older, you know, I'm more realistic, I've stopped chasing rainbows, I've lowered my expectations. Sad place to end up. Well, I discovered that failure of those first 3 levels to really provide happiness, I really discovered the hard way myself how trying to live just at those levels can let you down back in my late 20s. In my late 20s, I was doing really well at work. I was working for a hospital in South London. I'd worked really hard. I was ascending through the ranks of the place I worked for and doing well and getting promotions. I'd started a small business on the side on my own, doing some computer software development. That was going really well, and it was really looking like money might begin to start rolling in. Outside work, myself and a few mates had set up a youth work charity, and we're seeing some real impact made in our local community. We felt really good about that. But what I didn't realize was that at the same time, I was burning myself out. I was burning the candle at both ends, and actually, quite frankly, pouring petroleum over the candle and setting fire to the thing. And with stress and burnout growing, I went to see my local GP, wrestling with stress and anxiety. And my GP asked me some questions about my week, and I rolled out all the things I was doing and sort of boasted about all the different activities I was involved in. And I remember my GP looking at me after 5 minutes of my sort of bragging about all the stuff I was doing. My GP looked at me and asked a profound question. He said, Andy, what is it you're trying to prove, and to whom are you trying to prove it? What an incredible question. I had tried to find happiness and satisfaction and peace and my identity in my work, in my performance and things I was doing, and I'd ended up profoundly unhappy. So if you can't ultimately find happiness, if you can't find this story of happiness we're looking for in levels 1 through 3, what is the answer? Well, I gave you some ancient wisdom a few minutes ago, 2,500 years ago from King Solomon. Let me share with you a bit more ancient wisdom as we begin looking at maybe what the answer here might be. One of the most influential Christians down through the ages was a gentleman called Augustine. Very influential Christian theologian and philosopher, had a huge impact on the culture around him, and even right down to today, being very, very influential. Well, as a 19-year-old man, he read a little dialogue written by the Roman philosopher Cicero. And in this dialogue, in this essay, Cicero considers a dilemma. And it's actually the paradox we've been looking at this evening. Cicero raises the question. He says, why is it that every person sets out to be happy, but so many end up wretched, as he puts it cheerfully? And Augustine was deeply moved by this book and deeply moved by the question. And he set out on a lifelong project to try to figure out why so many people end up missing the goal of happiness and satisfaction, contentment and joy. And after a lifetime of studying that question, Augustine concludes that you need 2 things for true happiness, 2 things you need for true satisfaction. He said you need to love the right thing, and you need to be connected to an ultimate source of joy and happiness outside of yourself. Do you know, in terms of love, Augustine concluded, the most important thing in many ways in life is not what you do. Our culture says to us it's what you do that matters. Augustine went, no, that's a load of old rubbish. What matters is what you love. What you love is the thing that defines you. Or, to put it another way, what matters is what you worship. Now that's the point in the evening where I've done this talk regularly, where sometimes you can sort of see a bit of a ripple going round through the room, because you can see some people here this evening. If you're a guest at tonight's event, you don't regularly come here to the church, and I've just used the word worship. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, Andy, this is all very well talking about worship, but I am not a religious person. Maybe when it comes to the football, yes, but other than that, I am not a religious person, so what's all this worship nonsense? Well, I have a bit of news for you this evening. We all worship something. Every human being worships something. One of the most influential novelists of the last 20 years or so is the guy on the screen behind me, David Foster Wallace. He was a Pulitzer Prize nominated writer. He was, before his death, he was an atheist as far as we know. Not a man who believed in God, but a man who, like Augustine and others, wrestled a bit with some of these questions that we're exploring this evening. And in an address he gave at an American university a few years before he died to a bunch of students, he said something very interesting on this question of worship. Let me read you David's observations. David wrote, or said, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice you get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if that's where you tap real meaning in life, you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. If you worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. If you worship power, you will feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. If you worship your intellect, being seen as smart, well, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on." And what David is pressing at, is digging at, is that all of us as human beings make something the center of our lives. All of us worship something. And if we worship the wrong thing, if you worship your career, if you worship your performance, if you worship your looks, if you worship some relationship, if you worship your success or your sporting ability, whatever it is, then that disordered love, that love of the wrong thing, will damage you, and actually it will damage the thing that you love. And the only way to escape that, is to break up out of happiness levels 1, 2, and 3 into happiness level 4. What is happiness level 4? I hear you shout internally in a very gentle Scottish way at me. Well, let me try and answer that by taking you back to the story that I began with as we close, the story of that former sports star on the plane. What happened after he shared his misery with my friend on that flight? Well, my friend just happened to have in her bag a book that she'd finished reading, and she actually gave it to him as a gift. It's a book that probably very few of you, if anybody here, will have heard of this evening, but it's an amazing read. The book my friend had in her bag, my friend Sandy had in her bag, was a book called Moonwalker. Moonwalker tells the story, it's the autobiography of a man called Charlie Duke. Charlie grew up in rural southern America in the first half of the 20th century, about 1920, 1930. And as a young boy, he always dreamed of flying. That was his dream as a young man. Well, a new farmer moved into the farm next door to his parents' farm, and that farmer had a crop duster plane. And he taught Charlie to fly. Amazing dream came true. Well, then Charlie's dream grew bigger. He wanted to apply for the United States Air Force and become a fighter pilot. That is a pretty tough entry program. But he applied, he went for it despite friends saying, "Now, they'll never take someone like you." And he got accepted. He became a fighter pilot and was trained to fly those really fast, exciting jets. But that then was not enough. His dream grew bigger. Then he wanted to become a test pilot and fly the really exciting, dangerous, scary stuff. And again, very, very few number of people get picked for that. Charlie trained, applied, got chosen as a test pilot. Well, his dream continued to grow because this was now the 1960s, and the astronaut program was beginning, and NASA was hiring test pilots to become part of the Apollo program. And he was like, well, that's obviously the next thing. So he applied to NASA, got accepted, and then the next part of the dream was, well, what if I could get picked for one of those moon missions? Again, the elite of the elite of the elite. But he made it. His dream came true, and he actually got to walk on the moon. And in 1972, Charlie went on the Apollo 16 mission. There he is in all of his finery, and he became the 10th person to walk on the moon. And he tells that incredible story of success after success after success in his book. But then he carries on, and in his autobiography, he describes coming back to Earth after the moon mission. He comes back to a hero's welcome. He comes back to a ticker tape parade. He comes back to an audience with a president, back in the days when audiences with presidents were a good thing. And media fame, celebrity. And then he describes waking up the next morning and reality hitting him with a blow. Because where on earth do you go after a flight to the moon? How do you top that? What is above that? And that growing sense there was nowhere left to go, nothing higher to achieve, almost tore his life apart. He ends up dabbling with drink and drugs. His marriage almost collapses. Total chaos because he has nothing left in his mind to live for. But then one day, he stumbles into this little country church, hears for the first time in his life the story of Christianity and Jesus Christ explained to him in a way that connects, and he suddenly discovers that there is something out there worth living for that is actually genuinely bigger than him. He discovered that actually only if his identity lay not in performance, not in fame, not in career, not in adventure or height or speed, could he at last find peace. And in the autobiography, he concludes, I used to say I could live 10,000 years and never have an experience as thrilling as walking on the moon. But the excitement and satisfaction of that walk does not to begin to compare with my walk with Jesus, a walk that lasts forever. And that was what I too discovered personally, minus the going by the moon bit, in the 1990s. As I reflected long and hard on what my doctor said to me, Andy, what is it you're trying to prove and to whom? I realized he'd put his finger exactly on the problem. I tried to base my identity on my work, my success, my performance. It almost destroyed me. As I reflected on that challenge my family doctor laid on me, it led me to rediscover the Christian faith in a new way and discover a God who offers me identity and acceptance and peace, not on the basis of what I have done, but on the basis of what Jesus has done, specifically in his work to reconcile me into God's family and friendship with my Creator. And the good news that I can cheerfully report to you, personally report to you, is that when you have discovered happiness level 4, like Charlie Duke did, like I have, like many in this church have here tonight, the wonderful thing is the joy and satisfaction that you find there flows back to the other 3 levels. Because now suddenly you can see the rest of life as a gift to be enjoyed. Food and sex and career and money and performance and image, self-sacrifice, all of those things don't become ways that we desperately try and prove our worth or desperately try and build our identity, but they simply become good gifts that we can enjoy. And so, in conclusion, my hope for each one of you here this evening is that if you have not yet discovered true satisfaction, true joy, true hope, a happiness and a satisfaction that come not from what you do, then maybe, just maybe, something I've shared this evening may help you take some steps towards discovering it. Because as Jesus Christ said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. And that isn't just a better story of happiness, it is the best story of happiness. Thanks for listening. Matty.